to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. This is our inaugural version of the podcast with video accompanying the podcast. So very excited to welcome Sally and Ian, my co-hosts on the show, to the show today. Because you may not be aware, but today actually marks the 1-year anniversary of the Varsity Blues scandal that hit the airwaves literally exactly 1 year ago today. I got an email from someone who said, "Did you see what happened with Felicity Huffman?" And essentially my world exploded for at least the next couple of weeks. We have a good show for you today. Sally, Ian, and I are going to talk about life post Varsity Blues. And then a little later in the show, we're going to talk about expected family contributions. So we'd love for you guys to stick around. My first question that I'm going to toss to the group, and I'm going to add my thoughts immediately and then toss it to the group, is what has changed? So actually, let me back up. For those listeners who maybe are not based in the United States, don't watch television, don't read the papers, live under a rock, somehow not aware, last year on this day, a number of parents were indicted along with a bad actor by the name of Rick Singer. And they were essentially doing things like paying to have tutors change their kids' test answers, I believe in some cases, possibly even taking the tests for their kids. They were pretending that their kids were playing sports that they weren't actually playing. And the coaches at some universities were actually then accepting them in exchange for money payments. So I can tell you that one major thing has changed since Varsity Blues, and that is that a lot of really rich people who never thought they would ever see the inside of a jail cell are now going to jail. So there is that. And if I could think of a list of things, stupid things that people have done in this world that would result in ending up in jail, this has to be close to the top of the list. But let's talk about what I think people really want to hear about, which is, what has changed. So, Ian, when we talked about this the other day, one of the things that came up were we've seen some policy changes. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so one of the ones that I think we were wondering about was, in our experience in college admission, I think that we never really did any fact checking. At least at Reed where I worked, and I think probably the same. You're both nodding, so I can see you today. So I can see that that's the same for you. And so we would only really look into something if there was a really major discrepancy between a component of the application that the student had produced and something that was coming from some other party, like a counselor or a teacher. So, you sign the application and says everything here is true and factual, and that's part of the application process. And I think that at the very least, what this scandal has triggered in especially some highly selective schools is you can't always take that for granted as being true when a student signs that information, signs that application. And so a few colleges have actually started to engage in the process of spot checking, or have said that they will engage in the process of spot checking. Yes. I don't know that it's necessarily true that they are doing so. And spot checks, of course, are not universal, right? So they're not looking into the reality of 40,000 applications and whether every piece of information there is true or not. But they are saying that we're going to verify some of this stuff, especially the stuff that is especially notable, the things that are the features of a student's application if they don't necessarily fit with the other components. And I think that that's something that kind of makes sense. I don't know. What do you think, Sally? Is that something that you feel like admission officers are excited about doing, interested in doing, that it's something that you wish had been done when you were reading applications, or is it just a necessary part of the process at this point?
I think, unfortunately, it's a necessary part of the process. And I will say that it started, actually, I know that when I was a high school counselor at the Archer School for Girls, which was a while ago now, UC Berkeley, well, the UCs in general had announced that they were going to start doing spot checks. And a couple of my students did get, not because they'd done anything wrong, but they just got the spot check. So they come into me very panicked. And I said, well, you didn't lie on your application, so there's nothing to worry about. And they didn't. And so they were fine. So I do just want to make the point that it had happened already, and kind of maybe not as broadly. I'm dismayed that it has to happen, but I do feel like it does. And I will say that sometimes I even hear people saying to me, well, how can they tell if I exaggerate? And then I'll sort of go through how that can create some red flags. And I personally do want to emphasize that those red flags can come up. Like, a student says that they won a writing award, or their essay quotes Proust. This is an example I've used quite a bit. And the student is a B student in college prep English. Her thing is science. That's the kind of thing that I can tell immediately is a problem. Yeah. There's some exaggeration going on here. So I do want to say that it's at least for me, at least at Chicago, we did kind of start to notice, like, this looks a little off. I'm a little suspicious of this. And this isn't reflecting well on the student. So I do kind of want to put out that it's not always just the major red flags. It can be smaller red flags that can kind of come to your attention because they don't make sense as part of the whole picture.
Right. And we're going to spend actually a whole segment today talking about that, because I think that speaks exactly to questions of authenticity. Mm-hmm. But Ian, you mentioned something where you said, do we think that's actually happening? And I think that's a really good question, because we know that at least, so Varsity Blues happened in March of last year. The admission cycle started up again. Well, the admission cycle is sort of always going on. However, for the kinds of schools that were implicated in this, which were generally those highly selective institutions, they were in the middle of kind of sending out acceptances at that point, right? Acceptance letters are typically coming in starting in March, and usually for the more selective, the closer you're getting to the end of March before you get your answer. So they're smack in the middle of their decision-making process. And then you go into yield process, where you are welcoming accepted students to campus, and you're going out and you're doing some more travel. And then you're spending your summer kind of gearing up and getting ready for the coming year. Yes, there was time for them to implement new practices. The question is, was there budget to hire anybody new to help with this information? I personally, not that I work with an extraordinary number of students every year, but none of my students were spot checked. I don't know if any of your students were spot checked. No. So that makes me wonder, again, we are a sample size of 3, and we each had, not huge caseloads of students. So I wouldn't want to say that we are representative of what happened to everybody. But the fact that not one of our kids got a spot check makes me wonder, is it happening? Could it be that actually when they started the budgeting process for this coming year, that now they are building in money for that? Will we see increases in oversight in the coming years? I don't know. What I do know is that large institutions, educational institutions, tend to be pretty slow to change. So I do wonder.
That's true.
What we're going to see.
I mean, it sounds a lot like, I tell my kids, you better be asleep. I'm going to come down and check on you in 15 minutes. I don't actually do that, but I tell them that I'm going to, because I want them to expect that that's going to happen. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if they were actually doing some spot checks for students just as a part of their process. But I imagine that it's very small. And the goal is like me telling my kids that I'm going to come check in on them. You better make sure that everything here is true and accurate.
One thing I would say too is that even if the kid doesn't know they're doing spot checks, they might be calling the counselor.
That's
again, as someone who was a counselor, I mean, I had long conversations with colleges. I did work at a small prep school. I had a very manageable caseload compared to what a public school counselor might have. But some of the students who were cheating were at Sage Hill School in Orange County. They had a small caseload too. So if the colleges had called that counselor, they would have found out the truth, because there was no evidence that the counselors at Sage Hill had participated in the fraud. So
right.
That's right. I wanted to ask you, because both of you have been leaders in different admission offices and obviously leaders here with College Coach. What are some things that you might do if you had worked in a leadership position at a university where this scandal had implicated some part of the institution? Would you have instituted spot checks? Would there have been something that you would change in terms of the practice? Is there anything that you can do as an admission office, or do you just hope that everybody is on the level?
I think that I would have, I mean, again, this isn't possible at every high school, but I think when I was at University of Chicago and I talked to various counselors, I would have started verifying with them the activities that were on the list, and definitely started verifying the athletic piece. I mean, that it's pretty fascinating, like how bad that got, right? So, I would definitely have tried to put into place some sort of a process to make sure that the coaches were on the up and up. Like maybe just even making sure that a student was playing. Yeah. And if they were playing, like, were they actually decent? Right. Like if you advertised a student to me as one of your top recruits, and then they're a bench warmer, that, which I think was the case at Yale, I want to know about that. Right. And make sure, or find out that the student was injured. That's a different situation. But that I think I definitely would have put into place. But it's a valid point in that how much time do people really have? Like, I say all this, but it would have been challenging. I mean, I would have tried to figure out a way to do it, but I can tell you that even now, as I'm thinking about it, I'm like exactly when this happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be in the admissions office, it has to be a higher up decision, right? So I actually felt like at Penn, there was a pretty good sort of administration built up around athletic recruits, and yet not implicated in the Varsity Blues scandal. However, the former head coach of the basketball team, this has seemingly escaped all media notice, but who's currently an assistant for the Boston Celtics, took money for going and training a kid. So now in this case situation, the kid actually did play basketball. However, he wasn't very good. And but the father had a lot of money, and he would come down and he would practice with him and coach him. And he even brought other players down, and they enjoyed a trip to Miami, and they all, played and practiced. And then the kid was admitted ostensibly as a basketball recruit, never played a game. In that case, he actually played basketball. So it would be nice if we could slam that door shut, that side door, which is what everyone kept referring to it as. And it does feel like that would be the easiest one to close. Yeah. But I'm with you, Sally. The admissions, and I still love to point out the fact that nobody in admissions has been implicated in Varsity Blues still, which tells you, I think, should make our listeners feel really good about the ethical nature of the people who do this work. Because the reality is that they're underpaid, they're overworked, they easily could have taken money. I have colleagues who were offered money and nobody did. Right. But you can't take that on in addition to everything else you're doing. So that would have had to come from the dean or even higher up than the dean. And it had to have funding attached if you're going to do more, would be my take on it.
I mean, I did have a thought that you could do some of it during the summer, like build it into the summer, and that because that is a slower time. But you're right, Beth. I'm not trying. Believe me, I can't believe now how hard I worked for how little money when I was in Chicago in particular. I mean, working weekends, I was like, and I was making how much again? No.
Yeah, exactly. And earlier, when we were talking about one thing that so the process itself hasn't necessarily changed. We know that maybe some schools are doing spot checks, but what about, I feel like it's added an interesting dimension to our conversations with students and parents. And I would love to get your perspective on that piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting. This is an example of the worst actors possible doing the things that horrify you in terms of what the process is, right? They're taking full advantage, committing actual legal fraud in this situation. But I think what it does do is it also helps people to check themselves a little bit in terms of what their approach to the process is going to look like. And the thing that horrifies me the most about this is that there's some element of parents creating a smoother path for their kids in a way that their kids actually didn't, in some cases, even know about. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that idea of a parent making a choice that's having long-lasting, lifelong implications for a student without consulting with them that I think is really, really problematic. And it's actually been kind of interesting to have this example as language that we can use when we talk to families as like, yeah, you don't want to be like those Varsity Blues parents. And the other parents will say, oh, yeah, definitely not. And you can have a little chuckle about that. But there are different levels to that scale. And I think the best sort of possible change from this is parents starting to say, this really is my kid's process. And I want to help to make them, be in the best place to advocate for themselves, to represent who they are. I want to be there to support them. But in terms of the parent-student relationship in Varsity Blues, that problem of going around your kid to create an opportunity for them, I think was really, really problematic. And it's been nice to have that as an example to point to for families that are doing everything ethically, but maybe still thinking about the right balance between parent and student engagement with the process.
Or maybe they're not being ethical, but they're not being illegal.
Right. That's right. Also possible. Right.
That's a place where I've enjoyed being able to push back and say, what's the message that you're giving to your student that they aren't good enough?
Right.
That's what's happening.
Right. You may not wind up in jail over that, but for me, almost the biggest tragedy, I'm sure if you're going to jail, you're seeing that as the biggest tragedy. However, for me, the biggest tragedy is what you basically said to your kids is whatever you've been doing clearly was not enough. Whatever you wrote that you thought was great, whatever work you put into preparing for this test, whatever it got yourself involved in outside of the classroom, that was not good enough for me. Now, granted, it's certainly possible that these kids weren't trying, weren't prepping, weren't doing anything outside of the classroom, but that's a whole other issue altogether, right? And what you're then saying is, so you haven't done anything, but I'm going to make it okay anyway. So,
something wrong with that. Yeah.
The mind boggles at the level of things that are not great about that.
Right.
But I'm going to put a pin in that. We're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit more about authenticity. So cool. I'm going to take a quick break. Don't go away.
All right. Perfect. All clear.
Cool.